Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video. In today's video we are going to be sewing the Ivy dress, which is my new sewing pattern that's just been released. The Ivy dress comes in a dress and it also comes in a top. The pattern is available in PDF format and is also, hopefully by the time this video is up, there should be the printed patterns ready. And I'm also going to be doing some sewing kits for the Ivy dress, which will include fabric, elastic, a pattern, a printed pattern with the instructions and everything. Everything that you need to make the dress will be included within the kit. Now the Ivy dress comes in two size sets. It comes in size UK 4 to 18, which is about a US 0 to 14, and it also comes in a 16 to 32 UK size, which is approximately a US 12 to 28. All the body measurements and finished garment measurements will be on the site, so you can click the little preview button, which is just under the add to cart, buy it now button, and that will give you all of the details that you need to know regarding your size. Now so many fabrics work really well for this dress, and I'm going to be using I think it's a washed cotton. I got it in like an end of roll sale and it didn't say exactly what it was, so I believe it's a washed cotton because I've had washed cotton before and it's very similar. It's a lovely textured cotton fabric. So many fabrics work well with this dress or top. I've used cotton, linen, I've used viscose, which if you're going to use viscose, try not to use something too light because it just sags a little bit. Crepe, linen and cotton blends. Obviously there are so many fabrics that you can use and it's just a case of picking something that's got the right kind of weight and drape. You don't want to use something too heavy for this, so you're not going to want to use something like a denim or something like that, and you don't want to use anything with too much structure. Like I like a cotton or a linen because it has just that little bit of structure to keep the shape and not be saggy, but it's not so structured that it's not going to drape or move. The goal of this dress is to be comfortable, which is why it is all put together with elastic. It has pockets. It's there to look a little bit dressed up without trying too hard or being uncomfortable in what you're wearing. I have also tried a hack of this, which creates a strapless version and midi length, so I will do a video on that soon as well. I think that's all you need to know for now. I don't think there's anything else left to say, so let's get straight into sewing it. For this dress, you will need your fabric, pattern, elastic, and all of your normal sewing bits and pieces like your pins, scissors, and your thread. Now, when it comes to cutting out your pattern, you can follow the cut and plans in the instructions if you wish for all your different fabric widths and things like that. Here, I'm going to cut out all of my pieces that I'll cut on a folded piece of fabric first. So anything that is cut to will cut a pair, will cut on fold. And then I'll cut all of my pieces that I need to cut on a single layer of fabric afterwards. When it comes to your pockets, you will need to cut 2 pairs. So cut your first 2 and then use the same pattern piece to cut another 2. Don't forget to cut some little snips into your fabric for the notches too, as we'll need those for inserting the sleeves and the pockets. Now my fabric is quite hard to see the right and wrong side, so I'm going to put a pin in the right side just to remind myself, and I recommend you do the same if you have a plain fabric. Now place your front and back bodice together with right sides facing and pin the side seams and the shoulder seam. Sew them together with a 1 cm or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance and then overlock to neaten. Once you've done all this, press your seam allowances towards the back and then top stitch the seam allowance down onto the bodice. This will help you later when we come to insert the elastic. Okay, so now we can put the top aside for the moment while we work on creating the neckline facing elastic channel that obviously the elastic will go through. And we're going to do this by creating some bias binding. So you should have 2 bias binding strips, or if you've cut out multiple pieces to create your bias binding, that's absolutely fine. If you've done bias binding before, you'll probably know how to do this, but I'm going to go through each step just so that you can see how to create it and then how to sew it. So we've got our 2 pieces here, and the first thing that we want to do is sew these together on one of the short edges. And once we've done that, we'll press the seam open so we have one full piece that will then turn into bias binding. So I'm going to quickly sew that seam and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to press it in place and all of that. Okay, so I've sewed the piece together, as you can see here, and I've just pressed open the seam allowance here. Now to create my bias binding, I've got this little tool here, and the final size of this one is 25 millimeters or 1 inch, which is what the final size of our binding needs to be. So I'm gonna use this, but if you don't have one of these, that's absolutely fine. All you need to do is take your whole piece, fold the entire piece in half lengthways and press it in place. Then you're gonna open it out and you're going to fold each edge in to meet that crease. So it will look kind of like this. So it'll be folded down the middle, which it doesn't really need to be folded down the middle like as such, but it's just to help you guide you for this bit. So each edge will be folded into the center and you'll press that the whole way along. That will be pressed to the wrong side, and there you have your bias binding. So I'm going to go ahead and do it with my little tool. Now if you have a little tool like me, I always start it by just pressing the top bit and then I'll use the tool to press the rest. So I'll do that now. So as I said, for this, I always just do the first bit myself. So you can see I folded it in half, and then I'm going to fold each edge in to match that center one. And then I'm going to use my tool to do the rest. Obviously, if you don't have the tool, just continue doing that the whole way along. So I pop it in the longer edge here. There's a little gap here and you just need something just to guide your fabric through in the first instance. So I normally use a pin and I just guide it through. Now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to continue pulling that through and pressing it as I go. So as you can see, I've pulled the first bit through and it's basically done exactly what I've done up here. And then this binding is going to be our elastic channel.
Right.
And there we have our bias binding tape ready to go. And if you were to open it out, it would look something like this. So now we need to apply our bias binding onto our neckline to create that channel for the elastic. So first thing we're going to do is turn our whole bodice so it's right sides out. Now remember, if at any point you get confused which is the front and the back, the armhole of the back has double notches and the armhole of the front has single notches. This is my back. This is my front. So I'm going to start on the front. We have our bias binding and we're going to open up one of the edges. And then when we open it up, we're going to have a raw edge. And then this raw edge is going to match up with the raw edge of our neckline. And then we're going to stitch this in place the entire way around the neckline through this crease that we pressed. But when we start, we want to make sure that we start a few centimeters down. We don't want to start right at the end of our bias binding, and that will make sense when we come to do it in a bit. So we're going to start up here at our shoulder seam, and you can see my shoulder seam here. We're going to place our bias binding. We're going to unfold one of the edges, like I said, and we're going to start a bit further down, a few centimeters down, about, say 5 centimeters or 2 inches down from the start point of your bias binding. And you're going to match up that 5 centimeters down with the shoulder seam, and you're going to match the raw edge of your bias binding with the raw edge of your neckline. And you're going to do that the whole way around. So I'm going to pin here, and I'm going to keep pinning. When you do this, don't stretch your bias binding. You don't want to be pulling this bias binding because it will just stretch. Now I've got my bias binding back to my shoulder seam, and you can see it's too long. We want it to be too long. We don't want it to be exactly the same as this, because what we're going to do is we're going to match these up eventually and sew them together to neaten it off, but not for now. So now we want to sew the bias binding onto the neckline, and equally, just as we didn't want to start our bias binding right at the shoulder, we don't want to start our stitching right at the shoulder either. So I'm going to start my stitching about 5 centimeters away again. So you're going to have this gap here. I'm going to start sewing here, and I'm going to sew in the crease the whole way around the neckline. And then when you get to the other side, you want to stop roughly the same distance away. We're leaving this edge open so that we can join our bias binding pieces and create a nice smooth circle. So now you can see here is my shoulder seam, and I've got a piece of bias binding here and a piece of bias binding here that are both attached but not all the way. So now what I need to do is finish off this gap. Fold either side of my bias binding so the raw edge of the bias binding is flush with the raw edge of the neckline, and I'm going to mark just at the top edge here, just where the shoulder seam meets the bias binding. I'm going to do the same on the other side to make it nice and flat. Mark just where that shoulder seam, can you see there? That shoulder seam intersects with the bias binding. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each bias binding piece, each end, and I'm going to match up where those pins are and pin it together. And then you can see if I now lay that out nice and flat, the bias binding is now flush with the neckline of the bodice, like so, and this seam should pretty much match my shoulder seam. Now if I lay it flat, you can see that these edges, these bottom bits also need to be matched. Now when we sew this together, we're going to sew with the other edge folded out just to make it nice and neat. We're going to lay everything out nice and flat, and then we're going to match up again where these two pieces meet the shoulder seam here, and I'm going to pin that. So those are pinned in place, and now if I take my bias binding away from the neckline, I can see that I've got to start my stitching here and finish my stitching here at that angle. So I'm going to sew that seam and then lay it flat and see how it looks. Okay, so here is my bias binding edge and here's my armhole, just so you can work out where we are. And this is the area that I've sewn flat, and you can see it runs nice and flat against the edge here and nice and flat here. So I'm going to trim these seam allowances back, and then I'm going to press that seam allowance open. Once I've done that, I'm just going to find my previous stitch lines here, and I'm going to match up the edge of my bias binding with the edge of my neckline and just finish the bias binding here and just close that gap. And then we've got a nice continuous bias bound neckline. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pull the bias binding away from the top, and we're going to press our whole seam allowance up towards the bias binding. We're going to do that, and then we're going to trim this seam allowance by about half. We're not going to trim the edge of the bias binding that's still loose. We're only going to trim the seam allowance that we've just sewn of the neckline. So in order to do this, I'm going to make sure that my bias binding is away from the neckline of the top. Just be careful that you don't press out the other folded side of your bias binding as well. You want to keep that facing in. Okay, so then if you can see here, my bias binding is nice and neatly pressed away from the top, and I'm going to go to the inside and I'm just going to trim back that seam allowance that we just pressed, the seam allowance where we've attached the bias binding onto the neckline. So now your bias binding should look something like this, and I'll zoom in just to show you. So now your bias binding and neckline should look something like this. This is the seam allowance we've trimmed down. This is the binding, and what we're going to do next is we're going to take this whole piece of binding and we're going to fold it to the inside of the top, and then we're going to sew right on this edge here. And can you see that now creates a channel for the elastic? So now we need to cut our elastic to size. So I'm making a size 10, and this is 20 millimeters elastic, 2 centimeters. And then I'm going to measure out, using my measuring tape, being careful not to stretch the elastic as I go, 87.5 centimeters. And I'm going to cut my elastic at that point, and then get rid of the other piece for now. I'm then going to attach a nappy pin. Now these are actually one of my favorite things for pulling elastic through. I used to use a bodkin, but I've decided since that I prefer a nappy pin, because can you see that the needle goes into this plastic section? They just don't come undone. Like if I pull that apart, a safety pin would normally, this would pull out and you can lose your elastic, or it can unpin it while it's inside. These never do. I never have an issue with these. So now this is my preferred method of inserting elastic. I'm going to attach my safety pin to one end, and then I'm going to find that gap that I left in the back of the binding, and I'm just going to feed my elastic through the channel. I'm going to keep going all the way around, making sure to keep my elastic nice and flat, and also making sure that this other end, so I'm just going to untwist it as I go, making sure that this other end doesn't come through. Okay, now once you get to the other end, you want to pull your safety pin and your elastic through so you have two ends that you can match up. And then I've got two ends here that I'm going to overlap by about 2 centimeters. And I'm going to sew a few rows of zigzag stitch back and forth over the two layers there, just to secure that elastic. So here we have where I've just zigzagged those together, and now I'm just going to pull and tug on my neckline a few times, like so, just to make everything, all the elastic go inside and lie nice and flat. I'm going to keep doing that until all the elastic is concealed. You want to keep pulling a few times and just kind of maneuvering the elastic around the neckline, just so that it's all nice and neat around, and that it's not too, you don't want too many gathers bunched up in one area. You want it to be similar the whole way around. So now you can see we need to close up the hole in our elastic channel. So I'm just gonna get that all nice and tidy, and then I'm gonna sew the hole closed, just starting at my previous stitching point and ending where my stitching starts again. Now at this point, if you have any labels, I've got a little label here. I'm gonna pop this just in the gap. This is another reason I like to start my seam at the back. Now I normally forget to put labels in, but I've made a few of these now, and without putting a label in the back, I always forget which side it's meant to be worn on, whether it's meant to be worn on my right arm or my left arm. So I'm going to pin that in, and then I'm just going to sew that hole closed. Okay, so the top is now done. I'm going to remove these pins that show me the right side of the fabric, because I don't need them anymore, because I can see the right and wrong side now. Now, the main bodice is done, so we can pop this aside for now, and we're going to start working on the skirt and putting those pockets in. So we need to start with our front skirt piece, and make sure you've marked your notches here. They're really important for this next step. I'm going to pop this aside. Now, this is cut and fold, so I'm going to open it out, and then I'm going to mark again with a pin, just to state that this is the right side of my fabric, so I don't forget. Now what we're going to do is take our pocket pieces, and I'm also just going to mark all the right sides of these as well. So we've got 4 of these. To start with, we're just going to need 1 pair of the pockets, so I'm going to start with these ones. Now this style of side seam pocket is a little bit different to a normal side seam pocket. So with this, we create the entire pocket on the front skirt, and then we attach it to the back skirt later. So we're going to start by taking both of our pocket pieces and placing them right sides together onto the skirt, matching up the edges, matching up the top edge, and matching up the notches. And there we go. So my pockets are both now in place. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sew our pocket to our skirt at the side seam, but just in between the notches. We're going to use a 1 centimeter seam allowance as normal, and we're going to reverse stitch at the start and end, but we're going to start at this notch and stop at this notch. And then we're going to do exactly the same on the opposite one as well. So I've sewn only between the notches. Now if you can see here, you probably see better on this side. Now my notches are quite small, so I've cut into the notch as far as I can up to the stitching. So can you see here, I've cut really, really close to my stitching without cutting through the stitching. So here's my notches, and when I fold my pocket away, I can now treat this bottom part as separate to this top part. And I'll do a bit of a close-up so you can see what I'm talking about there. So if you can see there, this part of my pocket is completely separate. Now I'm going to press this nice and flat, and then I'm going to understitch the pocket just between the notches. So understitching is essentially we're going to sew on the pocket side of this seam, and we're going to be sewing the seam allowance here onto the pocket, and that is just going to help keep our pocket to the wrong side of the fabric when we're wearing it and keep it nice and tucked away. So for now we just want to press all of this, and then we're going to do a row of stitching just along the edge here, and we're going to do the same for the other side. Okay, so now that's been done, we've got a nice stitch line going through. Now we're going to go to the wrong side of the fabric, the wrong side of the skirt, and we're going to trim the seam allowance between the notches, just the seam allowance between the notches that we just sewed down. We're going to trim it to about half the width. Now what we're going to do is we're going to turn this back to the wrong side along this seam line here. So not the stitching that you've just sewn, not the understitching, but the seam line here. We're going to fold the entire pocket back along this line to the wrong side. And you'll see here, your pocket might naturally do this, but if it doesn't, you might want to do it yourself. You just want to match up above the notch. You want to match up both of those pieces again so that wrong sides of the pocket and the skirt are together, and the same down here. You just want to match up those so that both of those are together as well. And you'll see you've got this notched area. I'll press that flat, and then the top stitching that I'm going to do is from this notch point here, I'm going to sew into the skirt by about a centimetre, whatever you want to do really. It doesn't matter too much as long as you don't go all the way out, but about a centimetre. And then I'm going to pivot and I'm going to sew all the way down, so a centimetre away from this edge here. And then when I get to my other notch, I'm going to sew a centimetre back. So I'm going to go ahead and press this, sew the top stitching, and then we can attach the other part of the pocket. Okay, so now this is the right side of our skirt, and our front skirt, and if we turn it over to the wrong side, make sure our pockets are put in place as they should be. You can now see that we've got the right side, because here's my pin, we've got the right side of our pockets facing us and the wrong side of the skirt. Now what we need to do is finish off these pockets. So we're going to take our other two pieces that we put aside earlier, and we're going to lay the right side, which is the side with the pin, on top of the right side of the pocket that's attached to the skirt. We're then gonna match up the edges and we're gonna pin all the way around, only pinning through the pocket layers, not pinning through the skirt. So I'm gonna pin all the way around. And then we're gonna sew the pockets. We're gonna hold it away from the skirt because we're not sewing the actual skirt, we're just sewing the pocket. And we're gonna start either here or here, and we're going to sew all the way around the curved edge of the pocket bag. We're going to ignore the straight edge here, and we're going to ignore the top edge here. So we're only going to sew around here. I'm going to do that on both sides and then also overlock that seam. Okay, so now this is the wrong side of the front of the skirt, and you can see that our pockets are now all in place. And now what we want to do, can you see it's all nice and neat to the wrong side? We now want to match up the top edge of our pocket, which we have here because we've got two layers of pocket, with the top edge of our front skirt. So I'm going to lay them all together and then pin it in place. So I'm going to pin those in place, match up the top of the skirt, and then I'm going to sew the top of the pocket down onto the top of the skirt with a 1 centimetre seam allowance just along this top edge, and that's just going to hold the pocket in place and stop it sagging when we wear it. Same with this side. Okay, so now I've sewn those pockets, they're all ready to go, and we need to attach the back of the skirt to the front of the skirt. So first things first is take your front skirt and turn it so that the right side is facing you, making sure your pockets are nice and flat so that you're not going to get any of the pocket caught when you sew your side seams. So we've got a nice flat piece there. So now we're going to take our back skirt, which is also cut on the fold, and again I'm just going to mark the right side of my fabric, and then we're going to place the right side of our back skirt onto the right side of our front skirt, and we're going to match up the side seams and just pin that in place whole way down. And when you get to the pocket, you just want to make sure that everything is nice and flush. Everything is matching at the sides, so the pocket pieces are matching up with your side seams so that when you match all of these up, they're nice and flush together. Now we're going to do that on both sides, and then we're going to sew this seam here with the 1 centimetre seam allowance. But when we do it, we need to try and make sure, I'm going to unpin it just to show you. We need to try and make sure that we don't catch this part of the pocket in the seam. We want to basically sew right up to this point of the notch here and right up to this point of the notch here. So there's a few ways you can do this. Sometimes as I'm sewing, I'll kind of use some scissors or an unpicker just to feel where that point of the notch is so that as I sew, I can go right past that point. Or sometimes I like to feel it before I even sew it and put a pin just in that way, the whole way along, so that I know that if I follow these pins, I won't be catching that part of the seam allowance. So I'll do that for this one. So what I'll do is as I sew this seam here, I'll also reach my hand up in between the layers and I'll pull that pocket out the way as I sew. And now we're going to press those side seams to the back of the skirt. So take your bodice, and we want to be looking at the hem of our bodice. And what we're going to do is measure 3 centimeters or 1¼ inch up from the hem of the bodice the whole way around. So we're going to measure it and then mark with chalk or a pin or just something so you can see where that marking is. So I've marked up the 3 centimeters and chalked it, and I've also put some pins in just in case for any reason my chalk doesn't show up or rubs off. And then I'm going to follow that to the back, and I'm going to carry on marking the 3 centimeters on the back as well. And then I'm going to take this so that I'm looking at the front again. So I've marked up the 3 centimeters and now I'm looking at the front of my bodice again. And I want my bodice to be the right side out. And then I want to take my skirt, but I want my skirt to be wrong side out. So you should be able to see your pockets. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to slip the top up through the skirt. And I'm going to match up the front skirt, right sides together, with the 3 centimeter mark on the bodice. So the first bit I'm going to line up is my side seams, just because that's easiest. And then I'm going to pin that in place, do the other side seam, match that up to a 3 centimeter mark. So the edge of your skirt should be matching the 3 centimeters you marked on the bodice. And then what I'm going to do is just pin it the rest of the way. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to sew the whole way around this, joining the skirt onto the bodice. We're going to sew 4 centimeters away from the bodice edge, which will be 1 centimeter into the skirt. So we'll sew all the way around here, and then this excess that we've got from the bodice is going to be what's going to create our elastic channel, which will make more sense when we get to that in a minute. But for now, we want to sew our skirt to our bodice 4 centimeters away from the edge of the bodice, or 1 centimeter into the skirt. And just in inches, for those of you that use inches, that is 1½ inches away from the bodice edge and 3/8 of an inch into the skirt. Okay, so now we have sewn our skirt onto our bodice, and we want to trim the seam allowance we just sewed. Now we don't want to trim this 3 centimeters off, just this seam allowance here. So let me zoom in and show you. Okay, so if you can see here, we've got our 3 centimeter seam allowance, and then we've got our 1 centimeter. We just want to trim this 1 centimeter back to about halfway. We don't want to trim this at all. Now you want to make sure you be really careful when you do this, because it's very easy to nip into the fabric underneath. So just take your time. Okay, so now we're at a point that we want to turn the rest of this seam allowance here, this 3 centimeters, into our waist channel. So start by taking your bodice from the inside and pulling it out like this. So now we're looking at the wrong side of the dress. So when you pull your bodice out from in between the skirt and pull it upwards, you'll notice that this 3 centimeters here pulls up towards the bodice, which is absolutely fine. That's what we want to happen. However, we want to make this seam that we sewed here nice and crisp. So we're just going to fold it down for a second and just press it along this seam. So we'll gently pull this apart. We'll gently pull away the skirt and the bodice to create this nice crisp line here. And as best as we can, we're going to keep pulling and pressing this down onto the skirt. And you can probably see what the next step is. Once we've done that, we're going to tuck this under by 1 centimeter, press it in place, and then that's going to create our channel. But we'll get to that in a minute. For now, we're literally just going to press this whole 3 centimeter section down. So I don't know if you can see what I'm doing here, but what I tend to do is pull on the top, just gently giving it a bit of a tug, and then I take my iron and press the opposite way to where I'm pulling, and that creates this nice sharp line here. That's all been pressed, all looks neat and tidy, and now what we need to do is finish off this waistband seam. So the first thing that I'm going to do is flip it back up just for a moment towards the bodice so we can get to the wrong side of this channel here. And then I'm going to take the raw edge and fold it into the wrong side by 1 centimeter. And I'm going to do that the whole way along and press that in place. Once I've done that, I'm then going to bring it back down to the skirt, and there we have a nice channel. So I'll sew that in place as close as I can to the edge, all the way around, again leaving a gap for the elastic. Now I'm actually going to leave my gap for the elastic at the centre back, but you can leave it wherever you want to leave it. Now, if you find it easier, you can actually tuck your bodice back inside the skirt while you do this bit. And I'll show you why that makes a difference. So if I tuck my bodice back inside my skirt, I can now get to this a lot easier. So I can go around and do the 1 centimetre without worrying about pressing anything else while I do it. Okay, so that is mine all pressed. And now because I put the top inside, I'm just gonna pull it back out and then fold that down towards the skirt. That entire channel can get folded down to the skirt. So now, as I said before, I'm going to pin all of this channel in place, and then I'm going to sew as close as I can to the folded edge, trying to keep it nice and flat the whole way around. And I'm going to leave a gap of about 5 centimetres or about 2 inches to feed my elastic through. And this is the centre back that I'm going to leave it at. So I'll start here and I'll finish about here. Now you can see here that I've done my waist channel and left the gap open for the elastic. And now we're going to do exactly what we did for the neckline. We're going to measure our elastic. So I'm making a size 10 and the required amount for a size 10 is 70 centimetres. And then I'm going to attach my nappy pin to one end as I did before, and then start feeding that through. Okay, and then we're going to do what we did before and overlap by 2 centimetres, well, 2.5 centimetres or 1 inch, and then do some zigzag stitching back and forth across that to fasten. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll finish off that hole. Now, in exactly the same way as we did the neckline, we're going to tug our waistband a few times to let the elastic all sit within the waistband. So now what I'll do is I will stretch this out so that I can make my hole nice and flat again, and I'm going to turn my machine back to a straight stitch and just close up this hole here, and that is the waistband done. Okay, so now we're at a point where the dress is basically done other than the sleeve and the hem. So what I'm going to do for the hem is I'm simply going to turn it up by 1 centimetre and press the whole way around, and then I'm going to turn it up again by another centimetre, press, and then I'm going to sew it the whole way around. So let's get onto that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the sleeve. So I'm going to just get my pattern off here. And I'm just going to mark the right size, usual. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start by folding our sleeve in half with right sides together. And then we're going to pin the whole way along here. And this is our underarm seam. I'm going to sew the underarm seam with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. And then I'm going to overlock this seam as well. So now we'll press the seam towards the back of the sleeve, and the back of the sleeve is the side with the double notches. Now you might find it a little bit awkward at the bottom of the sleeve because there is a point where it turns, and the reason that it does this is to allow it to be a little bit easier when you turn it up to fit, because obviously with this going out at this shape, we need the seam allowance to come in so that when we turn it up it fits. If it was the same width here and it went out, you're going to have loads of excess as we sew it up. So that's why that is slightly different. So while we're here, we're also going to sew the cuff or the hem of the sleeve, and we're going to do it in the same way that we did the hem of the skirt. So I'm going to turn it up by 1 centimetre and press in place. And then once I've done 1 centimetre, I'm going to turn it up by another centimetre and press that in place. So now you can see my nice neat hem, and I'm going to sew this in place right around the fold here. Okay, so now we're going to insert the sleeve, and this is the part that some people don't like. So in order to do this, we want to turn our entire dress so that it's wrong side out, and then we want our sleeve right side out. So I'm going to turn that to the right side. Okay, so now we have our single notch on this side and our double notch on this side. And what we want to do is we want to turn our stitch length to the longest stitch length that we can, which I think on mine is 4.5. And we want to do a row of stitching at 5 mil away from the edge. And we're going to sew all the way around from this bottom notch here, all the way around to this double notch here. When we do that, we're also going to make sure that we leave quite long tail ends of thread at the start and the end, because we're going to slightly gather this sleeve head to make it fit nicely into the armhole. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll gather it and I'll show you what it should look like. Here I have some tail ends of thread, and here I have some tail ends of thread, and I've sewn all the way around the sleeve head. Now I'm going to take the thread that is on the top, on the right side of the fabric, just this one, and I'm going to hold onto this and very gently pull. And can you see it creates a gather? I only want a really, really small gather on both sides. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold my threads. I'm going to hold the fabric and pinch the thread so that it can't go anywhere, it can't unravel. And I'm going to move those gathers up to the top of the sleeve head. And it should slightly curl up the fabric. Can you see it slightly curling it, just enough to kind of go over my fingers? Not too dramatic, it's not really fully gathered. And if you can see here, if I was to sew at 1 centimetre, there's no harsh tucks or anything here. So as I sew at the 1 centimetre, everything is going to flatten as I sew. Can you see there, it's curled up over my fingers? Okay, so that is your sleeve pretty much ready to go. And remember, if you've got too many gathers, you can pull some out. If you haven't got enough, you can just add some more by pulling on the threads. So now we're going to go back to our dress, which is wrong side out, and our sleeve, which is right side out. And we're going to put our hand up the sleeve so that you've got the underarm seam facing the palm of your hand. And then we're going to go up inside the dress, like so, up to the sleeve. And we're going to match the underarm seam that's in the palm of your hand with the side seam here. I'm going to match them up and then pin in place. Then what we're going to do is we're going to look for our center notch at the top here, and that is going to match up with your shoulder seam. So pin that in place. Next, you want to match your single notch on the side, and then you want to match up your double notch on this side, and then you just want to go around and match up the rest. You do have a couple of other notches up here that help guide you, and most of your gathers should be above that notch. And once that's all in place, we're now going to sew them together the whole way around using a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Now we need to make sure that we set our machines back to our normal stitch length, because obviously we put it to the longest one to do these gathers. So we'll do that, we'll change our stitch length, and then we'll sew a 1 centimetre seam the whole way around, and we'll overlock that seam as well. So before I overlock this, I'm also just going to pull out my gather threads that I put in the first place. Just make sure you grab the one that is on the top of the fabric, because that is the one that we initially pulled together. So I'm just going to gently pull them out, and once I've pulled the top thread out, I can pull the bottom thread out as well. And now I'm going to overlock. Now normally when I have a tail end of thread, what I like to do to neaten it off is I tend to just trim it slightly so that it's nice and tidy, and then roll the ends between my fingers, and then I take a wide eye embroidery needle normally, because they're blunt, and then I feed the overlock in through that needle. Now it has to be a wide eye because obviously you're trying to fit a few layers through this needle, and also you want it to be blunt because you're not sewing with it. So I pull those threads through, and then I go back and I weave it through all my stitching. I'll go back to about there, and then I'll just pull it through the stitching, and then I'll trim off whatever's left, whatever didn't get woven in. Okay, so that is our dress pretty much ready. Now we'll move on to doing the belt, and then that is this dress finished. Okay, so now we just have the belt to do, and to do the belt we have 6 pieces. 3 of them are going to go together to make one long piece, and then 3 of them are going to go together again to make another long piece that's exactly the same. So we'll start with the first 3. Now this is my centerpiece. It doesn't matter which one is your centerpiece, you can decide. If you've got a printed fabric, maybe that's something that you need to consider. And then I'm going to take one of my other pieces and match up the short ends and pin together. And then I'm going to do the same on the other end of my centerpiece. So I'm going to take my other piece and I'm going to pin it together. And then I'm going to sew down this edge and sew down this edge to attach the 3 pieces together, and then press them open. So then we will have a piece that looks like this. And I'm going to do exactly the same on the other 3 pieces. So while I'm here, I'll do those ones too. So now you can see here we've got 2 really long pieces. Now you can't see the full piece because they're hanging over the table. So I'm going to flip this piece over, so I'm looking at the right side, and then I'm going to take my other belt piece and place it on top so that right sides are facing. And then I'm going to pin these together and sew the whole way around. So I'm going to match up these seams. So I'm going to sew almost the whole way around, but I am going to leave a gap pretty much the whole centerpiece, or just on one of the sides. So I'm going to start about here. I'm going to go all the way to the end, up, all the way along the top, down, and then back until I get to about here. So it will leave a gap here where we can turn the belt right side out. So I'm going to go and sew that, and then I will come back to show you what it looks like. Okay, so now I've sewn my whole belt and I have a gap from here to here. Now, if you've got quite a bulky fabric, you might want to trim all of your seam allowance down, but mine's actually going to be all right. I'm just going to trim the corners, and you want to trim the corners, making sure you're not cutting into your corner stitching, and you don't want to be too close to it either. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that, but you want to trim it off just enough. There's a little tiny bit of fabric in between the stitching at the corner and here, because if you go too close, it can easily break. So now we need to turn this right side out, and the reason that I left such a big gap is because we've got quite a long length here that we need to pull through. So I'm going to reach my fingers in, and I'm just going to pull it out a little bit at a time. So I normally start with the first bit, and then I get in the tube and just carry on pulling. Normally I don't use my scissors. I try and find something that is blunt that I can push the corners out with, but I don't have anything on me right now. Now, depending on how long your piece is, you might find it a little bit difficult to access the corners. So just use whatever you can to get right up to the corners to push them out. Okay, I've turned my whole piece through, and what I'm now going to do is just kind of wiggle the fabric between my fingers to make sure that I can get a nice crisp edge where this seam is the whole way along the piece, and then I'm going to press it. And when I get to this bottom section where I've left quite a wide gap, I'm going to grab each side and basically put my fingers into the points here and give it a gentle pull, and it will naturally roll in the seam allowance. And then what you can do is you can press it in by 1 centimetre as you go. And then what we'll do is we'll top stitch the whole way around, and we'll close this as we top stitch. Okay, so I've given this a really good press, and if I open up the gap, you can now see that I've pressed in both of these edges. So I'm going to top stitch the entire way around now, which will then also secure this hole as I sew. And I'm going to top stitch just 5 mil away from the edge, and then that will be our dress done, and I'll show you the finished result.